Eric Hansen is a well-known chess streamer and YouTuber, and he is no slouch. He's a very strong player, rated over 2,600 over the board. But today, we have a game with him going up against Magnus Carlsen, really playing in the elite big leagues. This is the AIM Chess Rapid. This 15 minutes for each side, a 10-second increment. Magnus Carlsen has the white pieces. Eric Hansen has the black pieces. Let us jump right in. Magnus begins with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and bishop to c4, played by Magnus Carlsen. And now Eric Hansen plays knight to f6. Bishop c5, the Italian game, is a little bit safer, but the two knights defense is a pretty aggressive opening from black. White has a few responses. One is knight to g5, immediately aiming for the f7 square. This leads to very sharp lines. One of the variations here is the fried liver attack, for example, just one of them. But here, Magnus plays d4 instead, and it's still aggressive, but a little more positional. Pawn takes. Now e5. Hits the knight at f6. Black has to make a decision. There are a number of reasonable options. Knight to e4 can be played, knight to g4. But the main move by far is what Eric Hansen played, which is d5, immediately counterattacking the bishop on c4. Now, this might look like a Max Lang attack. It does have some of the same structural similarities, but this is not the Max Lang. And if White tries to play it that way, White's just going to be in terrible shape. Taking the knight just gives you a terrible position. Take the bishop. And now check, and here Black is just fine. And he's just up a couple of pawns and would be winning. No, the correct response here is bishop to b5. Hitting the knight on c6 so White can take the pawn at d4. Knight to e4, the knight has to move, it was under threat. So now bishop to d7, after knight d4, bishop to d7, and bishop takes c6. Black really never takes with the bishop. It might be playable. I think the problem really is that you want the pawn to be able to eject the knight from d4, and also there's nothing covering f5, so f4, f5 can be played much more easily. But the main move here, and the one played by Eric Hansen, is pawn takes. And the main strategical goals here for White is to get an iron grip on the c5 square. Black will do everything to prevent that from happening. And then once that is gotten, you play f4, f5, and sort of attack on the king side is the idea. Castles, bishop c5, hitting the knight, bishop e3, bishop b6, and f3. Instead of playing f4 in one move, you play f3, and then hit the knight a second time with f4, and then the knight jumps back in. That way White gains a tempo. In this case, actually, Magnus played c3, defending that knight on d4. He might later play b4 again to try to claim that c5 square. Castles, and now f4, knight to e4. And this knight is very well placed. So knight to d2 challenges that knight. But instead of trading it off, Eric Hansen plays the move c5 immediately, putting pressure on this knight. And the main move here is knight 4 to b3. Again, trying to put as much pressure on the c5 square as possible, but Magnus plays a little differently. He plays the move knight to e2. And the threat here is to take on e4, then play knight g3, and retake the pawn, and White would be in very good shape in that instance. So Eric Hansen just goes ahead and grabs that knight on d2 now. Queen to d2 threatens to take the d5 pawn, and so bishop to c6 is played. Black does have the two bishops, and they could become very active. By taking with the bishop, though, again, this f5 square is no longer defended, and Magnus goes right in and plays f5 immediately. And we see this structure. White has a central space and kingside space, but Black has queenside space too, and Black immediately plays d4. Trying to take advantage of his two bishops. It's a temporary pawn sacrifice. After pawn takes, knight takes d4. Bishop to d4 would actually be a very bad blunder, because then Eric Hansen would play bishop to b5, which pins the knight to the rook, undermining the bishop at d4, and White is actually lost in this position. So instead, he takes with the knight, but now queen to d5, hitting the g2 pawn, which is currently defended by White's queen, but it's still a little scary to have that pressure. Also, the rook at a8 is coming to d8 to take advantage of that knight. So Carlsen moves his queen out of the way, first of all, to avoid that pin, but that allows Black to recover the pawn. Now, knight takes c6, and queen takes e3. Queen takes, bishop takes e3 check, king to h1. So we have our position here. It's a knight versus bishop endgame. Black has some pawn weaknesses on a7 and c7, but this f5 pawn for white could become vulnerable as well. But black does have the better minor piece at this point in the game. a5, Eric Hansen wants to play rook a6, develop his rook, maybe gain a tempo against the knight. Rook a to d1, bishop to c5, rook to d5. Hits the bishop. If he goes all the way to the 7th rank here, then bishop to d6 sort of locks up that rook. So rook to d5, bishop to d6. Now knight takes a5. So Magnus Carlsen has won a pawn, and that may look like, well, he's just winning. But in fact, the position is still fairly equal, even though he's up a pawn, because black can move his f8 rook to b8 and get compensation similar to what you might see in a Benko gambit and put a lot of pressure on these A and B pawns. So the position is really equal, even though Carlsen is up a pawn. And probably rook f to b8 was the best choice. But instead, Eric Hansen played rook f to e8. He wants to aim for this 7th rank. a3, rook to e2. Of course, that hits the b2 pawn. So knight to c4, defends that pawn and puts some pressure on this d6 bishop. Bishop to e7 was played. Computers prefer king to f8. They don't mind the loss of material in the short term. Knight takes, pawn takes. And here, rook to b1, just rook to c8, and black is activating on the 7th rank. And if rook takes d6, just rook takes b2, and that's just completely equal. Bishop e7 was played, and now rook to d2. Magnus is up material, so he wants to neutralize any pressure black might have. He wants to trade pieces if he can. Black wants to avoid it. It's the knight. Rook to c2 defends the knight. h5 controls the g4 square, keeps white from playing g4 himself, also gives the king a little luft. He might be able to get out of there. g3, h4, he'd like to play h3 and keep that king pinned in on the h1 square with all kind of back rank threats. Magnus doesn't want that. So he plays king to g2 to control that h3 square. Bishop to f6, bishop on the long diagonal. b3 out of the aim of that bishop, and rook to d4. Rook to f3, and rook to d1. Eric Hansen understandably wants to get behind these passed pawns. Computers show that probably the better way was to play king to h7 and activate the king, but in an actual game, deciding whether or not to activate your rook or your king is really hard for a human being. You do whatever looks best. And rook to d1, which does make sense, getting behind the pawns was played. a4, rook to a1. Now knight to e3. Now here you see white is unveiling an attack on the c7 pawn. White has a good position, really good position now. Perhaps bishop to e5, defending that pawn was the best choice at this point. But instead, rook to d8 was played by Eric Hansen. The idea being that if white takes the pawn, perhaps he can activate the rook on the 7th rank. But instead, Carlsen plays knight to g4, hitting that bishop at f6, threatening to take it, get rid of a strong minor piece, and wreck the pawn structure. So the bishop has to move. Rook takes c7, and now rook to d2 check, but the rook can just interpose. He blocks that check, and again, black does not want to exchange pieces. Rook to d3 attacks the pawn at b3, but now a very powerful combination from Magnus Carlsen. Can you see it? That's right. He plays rook to c8 check. And when the king moves to h7, knight to e5. I guess he could have interposed here instead of moving the king, but that would leave the endgame much more easily winning for black. So instead, king to h7, but now knight to e5, hits the rook at d3, attacks the pawn at f7, and that's curtains. If black moves the rook, I mean, he'd have to move the rook not to lose decisive material. Let's say he takes the pawn at b3, then knight takes f7, threatens mate on h8, as well as taking the bishop. And the only way to avoid mate, the bishop's got to go back. I mean, it's actually mate in 11, according to the computers. Eric Hansen, realizing this, in this position, resigned. And even after this great game for Magnus Carlsen, there's still some great chess you're missing out on. The video you're going to want to see is this video right here for some more great chess from Magnus. I believe you're going to enjoy it.